rebuttals, we're going to begin going back to those main issues that I highlighted at my 1NC, my last negative speech, and basically showing you that we are seeing, when it comes down to reality versus the media hype that we're seeing when it comes to the 1-2-3 agreement, there is really 1-2-3 agreement and any of these countries going nuclear are two entirely separate issues. And the affirmative team is trying to link them through their case, but we see there's really no advocacy saying we should, because of Iran or any of these other countries, withhold 1-2-3 cooperation with Russia. It's two separate policies. They said, oh, let's look for some economic leverage we have over Russia. Oh, look, we have 1-2-3. Let's try to throw it together. But the fact is that these two issues fundamentally do not match. There's nothing in common. It's the completely separate issue. That's what we're going to be seeing in this speech as I go down the issues and really do some weighing and impact analysis here. Let's start off, though, with a couple of the burden of proof points I phrased in my 1NC. The first issue is whether or not he could prove that America will be more secure. This is basically coming down to the issue of whether or not we can prevent Iran from getting the ability to launch a nuclear attack on the United States. I'm going to be addressing that a little bit later on in my speech. But here's my main point here. When it comes to America's security, the affirmative team has failed to prove that we can prevent Iran from going nuclear. Essentially, the evidence I read in my 1NC says they are at the point, Judge, where maybe a year ago in 2010, when the affirmative team's evidence was written, maybe then we could have prevented it. But the fact is, today, Iran does not need any more international assistance on their nuclear program. They are just taking the time that it takes and the technology that they have to reprocess the uranium several times to get it to a high enough enrichment level. That's essentially the stage that they're at. They're just waiting for the time until their uranium gets to the high enough enrichment level, and then they are capable of nuclear technology. They need no more foreign assistance. My second response was dealing with the whole issue, the other burden of proof points. They fundamentally cannot prove that 1-2-3 has helped any of these countries' nuclear weapons programs. They cannot prove Russia has given anything to any of these countries that directly helped their nuclear weapons programs. They cannot prove that Russia will choose 1-2-3 over any of these programs. Again, as I said earlier, they have no advocate here, so they have some analysis for sure, and I'll be addressing that. But they have no clear expert who's coming out and saying we can use 1-2-3 successfully as leverage. The fact is, we can't. Here's the fundamental matter of the issue. We are giving Russia technology upgrades. We're not giving them anything new. My partner talked about that in his speech. The second link here, Russia is not giving any of our technology to any of these countries. They have failed to prove that this entire debate on a single example of that happening. So there's breach one is that we're not giving them anything they need. Link two, gap two in the affirmative team's logic is that nothing is going to those countries from the United States. The third gap in their logic is that these countries are going to go nuclear anyways, especially Iran. At this point, it is too late. The impact to all of that is, when it comes to weighing, we are going to get nothing, and we are going to isolate Russia. There's too many gaps in the logic of the affirmative team's plan. No advocate piecing it all together saying it's going to work. It's not a good foreign policy. Let's go down to the line by line now. Subpoint A, talking about Iran. I have two main responses to this point. My first is that it's too late, quite frankly. Maybe 10 years ago this would have been a good policy to consider, but not right now. Iran does not need any more international help. They are at the point where, as I said before, they have the capability to enrich their uranium. They just have to run it through the process multiple times. Each time it gets a little bit more enriched. That's the stage they're at. They're just getting it to a high enough enrichment level. They don't need anybody's help. My second response, there's no proof that Russia is going to even comply with this. No proof that they would stop any supposed cooperation they've been doing with Iran. Let's move on to the B and C points about Syria and Venezuela. First of all, the risk versus fact issue. I agree that risk should be avoided, but the fact is we should not isolate Russia over risks that could not be proven. Sure, if this was a no-cost issue, if there were no disadvantages, an affirmative ballot would be justified, yes. But the fact is there are significant disadvantages when we weigh this. We say unproven maybes, a potential risk here, maybe a trade there, maybe something in the future, is not worth isolating Russia over. Second response to this, Russia is not going to risk long-term trade cooperation for $20 billion. The affirmative team only directly deals with nuclear agreements, but look at the fact that we're dealing with trade relationships with these countries. Russia has essentially upgraded Syria's military for them. We are talking about long-term economic partners. Russia is not going to isolate 3 economic partners for the United States. Third point underneath here, very important, is the issue of dual-use technology. My 1NC evidence very clearly said that we cannot, right now, the 1-2-3 agreement with Russia would have to be amended to allow for dual-use technology. I urge you to look at this evidence after the round if it becomes an issue. The fact remains here, though, that the problem here is that we currently do not have, with Russia, India is an entirely separate country, entirely separate issue. Right now, as the text stands with 1-2-3, no dual-use technology is going to Russia. None of that is going to Iran or any other country. We take a step back. We see the affirmative team has ultimately failed to uphold the burden of proof. And And on a weighing analysis, we have to choose to engage Russia, not isolate them. Thank you.
The issues of the debate round, I want to remind you that the highest priority, as my partner addressed in this debate round, is ultimately the security of the United States. So as we go over the 3 voting issues I'll be looking at in this debate round, I'll be looking through that lens. Let's start off with voting issue number 1, the threat. Let's start off with subpoint A, which is Iran. I'd like to just take a step back and look at what we as the affirmative team have proven and what the negative team has not refuted in this debate round. First, that if Iran gets enough foreign assistance, they can develop, by 2015, an ICBM that can hit the United States. That is with foreign assistance and only with foreign assistance, a card from the 1AC. Second, Russia is Iran's biggest supplier for nuclear technology. They're their biggest nuclear ally in their goal of developing a nuclear weapons program. Third, through Russian assistance and Russian assistance only, Iran has been able to develop capabilities through Bushehr to have enough nuclear, near weapons grade nuclear material to make 30 atomic bombs per year. None of those points have been disproven in this debate round and still stand. Let's go on to Syria, subpoint 2. What we have proven is that with Russia's assistance, there is the potential for Russia to actually create another Syria like Iran, another situation like the situation in Iran within Syria with their nuclear weapons program. But it is early enough to prevent. Third, subpoint 3 with Venezuela. What we have proven is that the freeze currently in Venezuela is only temporary, and once again, there's the potential for a weapons program. None of those points have been disproven in this debate round. So that is the voting issue number 1, the threat. Let's go down to voting issue number 2, current policy. I'll be dealing with the tech point later on, but I'd like to point out that the point that we brought about political reward, the fact that the United States is actually encouraging Russia politically to help Iran, was never addressed by the negative team. I'll spend the bulk of the speech dealing with the third voting issue, which is the solution. All of the solvency points and disadvantages, I'll be retagging some things. First of all, I'd like to step back and redefine our harms. What the negative team has done is they've redefined our harms and tried to encapsulate more problems into our case that is actually there. I'd like to go back and look at what we're trying to solve for. As the affirmative team, we do not have to solve for every single proliferation issue out there. In fact, we don't even have to prevent Iran, Syria, and Venezuela from going nuclear. What do we set out to do? We set out first and foremost to protect our technology, secondly to leverage the 1-2-3 agreement instead of wasting it and convince Russia to change. Let's look at the individual arguments from the negative team. Solvency point number 1 was links. I have 3 responses. First of all, civil technology is dual use. Civil technology is dual use. Proved from the PhD Matthew Furman in our first speech, technology that is civil can also be used for a nuclear weapons program. What does the 1-2-3 agreement exchange? Civil technology. That's link number 1. Second of all, uniqueness. Technology, U.S. technology cannot be given to Russia outside a 1-2-3 agreement. Our technology won't go to Russia unless the 1-2-3 agreement is enforced. Finally, does the 1-2-3 agreement actually allow dual-use technology? Yes. Not only the evidence from Matthew Furman talking about civil technology generally, but also the historical example of India was read into the round to prove this 1-2-3 agreement does actually allow for the exchange of dual-use technology. The link is clear. Let's go down to solvency point number 2, supposedly that Russia does not use our technology. Once again, there is a negative misunderstanding. Our premise is not that Russia needs U.S. technology to build a nuclear weapon. We agree that that is not the case. Our contention is that U.S. technology is better. In fact, that's why Russia wants the 1-2-3 agreement to pass. So current policy makes it easier and more dangerous for Russia to have the best technology to help these rogue nations. That's what we seek to prevent under our plan. That's what we solve for. Let's go down now to a piece of evidence to actually further prove why Russia needs the 1-2-3 agreement. From Robert Einhorn, Rose Goldenmoeller, Fred McGlordrick, Daniel Proneman, and John Wolfshaw in May 2008. Quote, Russia recognizes that Western and U.S. companies have certain areas of technical advantage over Russia, just as the U.S. recognizes that it can benefit from accessing certain Russian capabilities. There are still gaps in the Russian nuclear energy chain and areas where U.S. technical expertise could improve the outlook for Russian exports. This is especially true in the area of control and safety systems. Russia is behind the U.S. Let's go down to solvency point number 3. Rogues don't need nuclear weapons. First of all, we proved that Iran, Syria, and Venezuela do need the need Russia's help to get these programs. Also, I'd like to quickly read a piece of evidence from Reuters in 2010, quote, Iran does not currently have the ability to make a nuclear bomb on its own. Let's go down quickly to the disadvantages. Disadvantage 1 of isolating Iran. Current policy is failing. That is what the negative team is advocating you keep. We did read advocacy for our plan. And finally, the catch-22, we deal with this under mandate 3. What we can see is that the threat exists, current policy fails, and that we do provide a solution to solve for the harms we actually attempt to solve for. Thank you.
American citizens depends in large part on preventing rogue nations from launching missiles against us. And it's only the status quo that allows that to happen, because Iran will go nuclear, and the possibility of Venezuela or Syria getting a nuclear program is quite high. We agree with the affirmative plan on that. What the affirmative never has responded to, though, not in the 2AC and not in the 1AR, is the fact that repealing or suspending the agreement, rather, pushes Russia to Iran, and my specific card that I read in my speech that said it inhibits future cooperation with Russia on Iran. That's what the affirmative gives you. They give you a plan that solves nothing, has no link, and inhibits the future ability to solve the Iran issue that they've identified themselves. Now let's look at significance. Basically, the last affirmative speaker said future assistance is key. Boucher gives Iran the ability to make nuclear weapons. Russia can make Syria into Iran version 2.0, and that the freeze is temporary for Venezuela. I agree with all of that because 123 was never linked to this assistance. All this assistance, look at Boucher. From the very beginning of the speech, Boucher has happened without the 123, and they're claiming Boucher is key to Iran getting nuclear weapons. Russia can and Russia does help Iran, help Venezuela, help Syria without the 123 agreement. The affirmative gives you no solvency at all. Now they say, we don't have to stop proliferation, we just need to protect United States technology. Protecting United States technology is, one, irrelevant at the point where Russia isn't proliferating our technology, and they've never proven that. Two, irrelevant at the point where Iran has already, or Russia rather, has already everything that they need to give to other countries. And three, the important fact under dual-use technology, that we're not giving Russia anything that could be used against us. Now let's go there. They basically said in the last speech that civil technology can be dual-use, and that's absolutely correct. It can be. There's also civilian technology that's not dual-use, and they say that India proves all civilian is dual-use. Two responses. One, not once have they read a card counter to my partner's initial argument that said directly, quote, 123 agreement with Russia provides a comprehensive framework for U.S. peaceful nuclear cooperation with Russia. The agreement does not permit transfers of any restricted data and permits transfers under the agreement of sensitive nuclear technology only by amendment of the agreement, unquote. They can't tie a separate country's agreement into the direct Russia-specific card and say, therefore, it applies. It doesn't. Actually, now would be a good time in the round to point out what they brought up in the 1AR is all they can bring up. No new analysis, no new responses allowed in the 2AR because we don't have a 3NR as much as I would like it. My partner wishes I do, so I don't rant to her at the table. Alright, now let's move to the disadvantages of the solvency. Basically what they said under solvency was that Russia doesn't need United States technology to proliferate, and Iran gives Russia the best technology to help rogue nations. What I would use to respond to this, pull through my entire burden of proof argument. They never touched it. They have never proven to you that the 123 agreement gives Russia technology they don't already have. They have never proven to you that Russia doesn't have some technology that it needs to help rogue nations, and they have never proven to you that rogue nations need something that they don't already have. They read a piece of evidence from 2010 saying Iran needs foreign assistance. Our card from 2011, June 7th, said Russia is 2 months away. Iran is independent, Iran is 2 months away. Iran is completely independent. The 123 agreement gives them nothing. The disadvantage, basically, all that they said was Mandate 3 solves, and basically that's what my C point was. They can't get up here and say Mandate 3 solves because they didn't clarify it in their initial text. What you get under the affirmative plan is they leave the door wide open for Russia to abuse the reinstatement of this amendment to finish sharing, if you believe all their argumentation, to finish sharing what they're already sharing, then say, look, we're stopped, can we have US tech now? That's That's what the affirmative leaves the door open for if you buy their argumentation. So what's the calculus at the end of the round? Basically what you're looking at is the fact that an affirmative ballot drives Russia to Iran. I repeat specifically a sentence from a card my partner read from Andrew Grotto 2007. Russia's increasingly assertive and at times belligerent behavior in the past several years ought to dispel any hope that holding up a nuclear cooperation agreement will coerce a fundamental change in its Iran policy. Rather, it would serve to strengthen the hand of hardliners in Moscow who reject Russian cooperation with the United States. The affirmative gives you three things. They give you no link, no uniqueness, and a disadvantage, a guarantee of isolating Russia. What the negative team gives you is the unfortunate reality that rogue nations will get nuclear weapons, but secondly, that US technology will not be used, that the 1-2-3 agreement does nothing to harm our civilians, and if you really want to uphold US security and hope to control Iran in the long run, we have to engage Russia through the 1-2-3 agreement. I'd ask for a negative ballot.
Peer past the rhetoric and examine the reality. And the reality of this round is that the negative team in fact offers nothing. They offer no reform, they offer no new action on Iran, Syria, or Venezuela, no guarantees we protect US technology or offer Russia any incentive to change. And the current failed policies of the status quo are inadequate. So that's why reform is justified. Now before we jump into the nitty-gritty, the different arguments I'll be addressing in this speech, we have to examine one key fact. And that is that the negative team has completely admitted Russia's assistance to rogue states such as Iran, Syria, and Venezuela. Now this has enormous implications in today's debate round. The reason is because we know that Russia is aiding weapons programs in Iran and potentially aiding weapons programs in Syria and Venezuela. That means current policy is failing. We have been trying to engage Russia for the last multiple presidential administrations. We've been attempting the policy of engagement and appeasement advocated by my opponents, and it hasn't worked for over a decade, since the Clinton administration. So for us to just put our head in the sand and blindly ignore the problem emerging in these rogue states is detrimental to our security, and it's hazardous rhetoric that is risking the safety of Americans. So with that fact in mind, the current policy is failing, and the fact that the negative team offers nothing while the affirmative team offers a reasonable solution to protect both our technology and to also provide Russia with an incentive to change. The answer is reform, not ignoring the problem. Let's move on to the negative team's 4 different arguments that they have remaining in this debate round, 4 different categories of arguments. The first was the claim that Russian assistance is not linked to the 1-2-3 agreement. Now I have 2 main responses, and these carry back all the way to the first affirmative constructive. The first response is, once again, we're talking about not US technology being new to Russia, we're talking about US technology improving on Russian technology, and thus improving the Russians' ability to aid these rogue states. And this was conceded by the negative team. When they admitted in cross-examination, there is a benefit to the Russians if we provide them with our own best nuclear technology. Again, this is lunacy. We're providing our best nuclear technology to a state that we know is passing on nuclear technology to some of the most dangerous regimes on Earth. Yet that is the policy advocated by my opponents. And the second response I have, again dating back to our very first speech, is that we are not only providing our own technology, we're rewarding Russia with it. We are actively encouraging Russia's policies of proliferation through this agreement, because we're not only allowing Russia to continue its proliferation, we're giving them a pat on the back and a $20 billion check in hand and telling them, you have our stamp of approval, keep on going. Again, evidence from the 1AC. That is the link between Russia's assistance and the 1-2-3 agreement. The negative team's second category of argument was about dual-use technology. Again, 2 responses. The first response is from the 1AC, and what it said was, and I quote, all types of civilian cooperation raise the risk of nuclear proliferation. Not some types, not a few types, all types of civilian cooperation, including the 1-2-3 agreement. And the reason is that that technology is dual use, as the piece of evidence pointed out. When you engage in civilian cooperation, you increase the risk of a weapons program. And my second response is to point you back to the precedent of India. What we know is that in the past, once we've signed those papers and gone through on a 1-2-3 agreement, the result has been transfer of dual-use technology, not merely civil technology. The negative team's third category of argument related to the burden of proof, and they had 2 different subpoints that I'll be responding to. The first was the claim that there's no new technology for Russia, and I believe I've addressed this. There's better technology for Russia under the 1-2-3 agreement, which increases their ability to aid and abet our enemies. And the second question the negative team has had in today's debate round is whether or not these rogue states need our assistance or Russia's assistance. Again, they never responded to the answers my partner gave in her first affirmative rebuttal, which were, number 1, Iran depends on foreign assistance for an ICBM to hit us. Number 2, they never addressed Syria or Venezuela, and the fact that they are completely dependent on Russia's assistance. Syria and Venezuela have, to our knowledge, no other source of nuclear assistance other than Russia, so they are dependent on Russia. And what we know is the status quo is failing on these rogue states, and current policy is not working. That's why we need reform. And the negative team's final category of argument was the claim that we can't stop ongoing cooperation between Russia and these rogue states. But again, I point you back to the evidence. What it said was, we need ongoing sufficient foreign assistance from Russia to Iran, and presumably to these other rogue states as well, for them to reach nuclear status. Ongoing assistance. Now, our third mandate specifically says, if Russia continues assistance, we cut off the 123 agreement for 10 years. So we provide a big leverage, a big incentive for Russia to permanently discontinue this assistance and not go on and off with us, re-engaging in cooperation. So with that in mind, I believe this round boils down to 3 affirmative voting issues. The first is the threat to our security, unaddressed by the negative, addressed by the affirmative team. Russia is aiding rogue states. This was admitted by my opponents, threatening Iran, Syria, and Venezuela. And the Iran threat is on the doorstep. Syria and Venezuela are on the horizon. We have to take preventative action. The second voting issue in this debate round is that current policy is utterly inadequate. Not only are we ignoring the problem, we are aiding and abetting Russia with our own technology, giving them a $20 billion check and encouraging them to continue their proliferating policies. And the third voting issue in today's debate round is the solution. We proposed a very reasonable plan, set new standards for the 123 agreement. And number 1, guarantee 100% that we protect US technology from falling into our enemies' hands. And number 2, provide a $20 billion incentive for Russia to align its policies with the US's. So at the end of the day, that's how you protect US security.